Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I would like to chat all about the character of Mrs. Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. This video has massive spoilers for this lovely book, so if you have not yet read Pride and Prejudice, please go and do so. Perhaps think about Mrs. Bennet a bit, and then return to this video at a later date. It's rare that I film a Jane Austen video when I'm not currently reading a book by Jane Austen, but one of my subscribers, who writes the best comments, asked what I think about Mrs. Bennet. I thought about it, and I decided that I could write a vague one-sentence response saying that I have mixed feelings about Mrs. Bennet. Or I could spend an hour or so writing a massive essay of a comment in response. Or I could work out my thoughts on Mrs. Bennet in a video with all of you guys. So that's obviously what I chose to do, and here we are. Mrs. Bennet is an interesting character in that each time I pick up Pride and Prejudice, I feel a little differently towards her. Sometimes I pity her and her plight and the situation she finds herself in. Sometimes I just love laughing at her because she can be a really silly character. Sometimes she's just so ridiculous and over the top that I can't help myself. She is just such a force of nature in this book, and sometimes she does things that are so socially inappropriate that I feel embarrassed on behalf of her and on behalf of her family. But as ridiculous and as comedic and as incorrect as she is about things sometimes, I also think that Mrs. Bennet is somehow a voice of reason, that she reflects what society values to some extent, and that she passes those values onto her children, sometimes in very problematic and detrimental ways. Pride and Prejudice begins with Mrs. Bennet inquiring all about the new neighbor at Netherfield. What kind of man is Mr. Bingley, and most importantly, is he single? Right away, we're introduced to the way that Mrs. Bennet is so determined and driven to marry off her daughters. And we see Mrs. Bennet imploring Mr. Bennet to go visit their new neighbor immediately. The whole scene comes off as really humorous and desperate, and it really isn't such a flattering portrait of Mrs. Bennet. So within the first few pages, we are given this rather nuanced description of Mr. Bennet, and immediately following that sentence, it compares Mrs. Bennet to him. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. So this section portrays Mrs. Bennet as a very vapid character whose sole purpose in life is to find husbands for her daughters. She comes across as rather intense and extreme in this desire, and the passage also basically calls her dumb. It says she has little information. It says when she's upset, she fancies herself nervous, and that makes me wonder if she actually is nervous or she just thinks she's nervous. She fancies herself nervous is different than she's a nervous person. And finally, she takes pleasure in socializing and visiting with other people and listening to their news. In essence, she is a big gossip. In the beginning of this book, we get the notion that Mrs. Bennet is silly, dramatic, and really quite over the top in the way that she wants to thrust her daughters at perfect strangers in matrimony. Mr. Bennet makes fun of her, and most of the time she's oblivious to his teasing. But I think that Mr. Bennet and the narrator both encourage us as the reader to make fun of her as well. At best, Mrs. Bennet comes across as enthusiastic in her endeavors and extreme. And many people think her far worse based on the early descriptions. It isn't until chapter 7, a little further in, that we start to understand the situation that Mrs. Bennet is in, and in some ways we begin to pity her, if you haven't already begun to pity her, with what she endures from Mr. Bennet's merciless teasing that consistently goes over her head. So it's in chapter 7 that we begin to understand the Bennet family's financial predicament. Their estate, Longbourn, is entailed on a male heir, and unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters and no sons. There is no male heir. So this means that if anything were to happen to Mr. Bennet, the home would be inherited by a distant male cousin, and Mrs. Bennet and her girls would be turned out from their home. These are pretty serious stakes, and as women during the early 1800s, the Bennet girls' best financial safeguard is to have at least one of the sisters marry well so that she can support and house the other women should anything ever happen to their father. These daughters really do need to get married or they will be destitute one day. Mrs. Bennet understands this better than anyone, and I really do feel sorry for her sometimes because Mr. Bennet is not exceedingly helpful in this matter. He does nothing to change the entail and the situation of their finances, and the two of them have stopped trying for a male heir by this point. Mrs. Bennet has to convince Mr. Bennet to do anything in service of furthering their daughter's marriage prospects, and he's not going to do it of his own volition. In some ways, he's been a rather irresponsible partner. He hasn't provided a stable, sustainable future for her or for their children, and that was something that was absolutely expected of him in this time period. But then again, it's kind of hard to maintain sympathy and pity for Mrs. Bennet when she does desperate and dangerous things, like sending Jane off to Netherfield in the pouring rain so she can be stuck there and taken care of and interact with Mr. Bingley. And when Mr. Bennet pokes fun at her by pointing out how frankly insane this scheme is, he says if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders. So he's telling her how risky and dangerous this behavior is in a really humorous way. And Mrs. Bennet's genius response is, "Oh, I'm not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds." Yeah, so people do die of little trifling colds in Jane Austen's time, before modern medicine. So Mrs. Bennet is incorrect and really foolish, but also, is she really that desperate and irresponsible that she's willing to risk Jane's health and safety, her life even, for the chance of interaction with a potential suitor? Or is she just that stupid? And part of the humor in this book really comes from Mrs. Bennet's ridiculous schemes and the lengths she'll go to further her children's marriage prospects. And yet, these situations seem to suffer from Mrs. Bennet's own dim-wittedness and lack of understanding. When Mrs. Bennet goes to check on Jane at Netherfield, she's incredibly embarrassing and inappropriate, and she makes so many social faux pas and snafus, it's ridiculous. She's so overeager to insert herself in her daughter's affairs that she actually hinders Jane's chances with Bingley. In that scene at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet chastises Lizzie, to which Mr. Bingley promptly responds by changing the subject. She shamelessly promotes Jane and her merits in a way that, if Jane were present, she would crawl under the table in humiliation. It's as if Mrs. Bennet were solely there to advertise on Jane's behalf, which she kind of is. That's kind of her scheme. And then she keeps arguing that London doesn't have any great advantages over their country society, which is a ridiculous argument, but especially insulting in front of her present company, because they're all used to London society. This is definitely not the right audience to say that to. In fact, Lizzie is so embarrassed that she has to interject and tell her mother that she's mistaken, and Lizzie blushes profusely. This is such an embarrassing scene, and Lizzie is mortified by Mrs. Bennet's impropriety and lack of social decorum. But then, of course, Lizzie and Mrs. Bennet don't always see eye to eye. One of my favorite passages about Mrs. Bennet involves her interactions with Lizzie, right after Lizzie has refused Mr. Collins's marriage proposal, and right after we find out that Charlotte Lucas has snatched up Mr. Collins for herself. Mrs. Bennet says, But I tell you what, Miss Lizzie, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all. And I am sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead. I shall not be able to keep you, and so I warn you. I have done with you from this very day. I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again. And you will find me as good as my word. I have no pleasure in talking to undutiful children. Not that I have much pleasure indeed in talking to anybody. People who suffer as I do from nervous complaints can have no great inclination for talking. Nobody can tell what I suffer. Yeah, so this is quintessential Mrs. Bennet. There's a kernel of sensibility and truth in what she says, but it's surrounded by melodramatic falsehoods that just completely discredit her and make me laugh hysterically. There's amazing irony in the beginning of this passage about Lizzie turning down proposals. Her mother's advice is that she'll never get married if she keeps refusing men like this. But that's hysterical because, first of all, when she turned down Mr. Collins, it actually only made him more eager to marry her. And second of all, we know that Lizzie does turn down Mr. Darcy's first proposal, and she still ends up married to him. Mrs. Bennet is wrong when you consider what actually happens in the rest of the book. But Mrs. Bennet actually has a sensible point here. Is it wise for Lizzie to be turning down marriage like this when you consider the financial state of her family and the lack of prospective marriages among her sisters? Rational advice from the time period would say no, that's not wise. They live in the country. There aren't tons of available suitors to be found there. And Lizzie's behavior is incredibly risky here, turning down a proposal that could ensure her family's financial future and keep her sisters and mother from being homeless. That's a bold move, especially considering that her and Jane are getting older in years. It's really risky, and the fact that she does it may even seem foolish when you take into account the family's financial situation. But I'd actually argue that one of the reasons Lizzie makes this risky move is because of Mrs. Bennet, or rather, the example that Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet have set for her. She sees Mrs. Bennet's relationship with Mr. Bennet. She sees that they don't understand each other, that they aren't suited for each other on an emotional and intellectual level, and that they don't have a mutual love and respect for each other. Lizzie knows that Mr. Collins and her relationship would be similarly unbalanced, and she knows that the two of them aren't suited for each other, and she isn't willing to enter into a relationship like that. I wonder if she truly realizes the risk that she's taking, or if she thinks that she'd rather be destitute than be Mr. Collins's wife. Or maybe she's counting on one of her sisters to make an advantageous match instead. Who really knows? As a modern-day reader and a feminist, I love Lizzie's decision not to marry unless it's based on mutual love and mutual respect for one another. But if I truly think about it in the lens of the early 1800s, Mrs. Bennet, she's right. Lizzie made two incredibly irresponsible decisions in turning down Mr. Collins and then Mr. Darcy, and she condemns herself to crippling poverty if none of her other sisters end up marrying well. So from Mrs. Bennet's point of view, this is really a dereliction of duty not to accept these proposals. And it can even be seen as a betrayal to her family. Suddenly, I see why she calls her undutiful. And then, in true Mrs. Bennet fashion, she ruins any rational point she made by being ridiculous. She says that she doesn't take pleasure in talking with anybody, which is just patently false. She's a very talkative character, and by this point in the book, we all know that. Mrs. Bennet actually has some valid and reasonable points here, and yet her ridiculousness, her melodrama, and her social impropriety actually hinder her daughter's marriage prospects, and certainly hinder us from taking her seriously. So, as we see, Mrs. Bennet's schemes aren't always so smart. With regards to Jane, Mrs. Bennet was willing to risk her life for the chance to catch a suitor, and she's the one who wholeheartedly convinces Lydia to go to Brighton with the soldiers. This is Mrs. Bennet's farewell to Lydia. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she would not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible, advice which there was every reason to believe would be attended to, and in the clamorous happiness of Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more gentle adieus of her sisters were uttered without being heard. So Lydia wholeheartedly goes off on this adventure, and we know that she ends up running away with Wickham. And perhaps her sisters were trying to warn her of something like that. In the end of the paragraph, it says the gentle adieus of her sisters were uttered without being heard. Maybe they were warning her to be careful and to not flirt too much. Who really knows? But they weren't heard anyway, so we don't hear them either. It seems like Mrs. Bennet encourages this type of behavior. She's instilled values in Lydia of flirtation, of beauty, and finding a man at any cost. And then, of course, when Lydia and Wickham run away together, Mrs. Bennet is distraught. It says that she greeted the rest of her family with tears and lamentations of regret, invectives against the villainous conduct of Wickham, and complaints of her own sufferings and ill usage, blaming everybody but the person to whose ill-judging indulgence the errors of her daughter must be principally owing. So, who is to blame? One might argue from this passage that it's actually Mrs. Bennet who's to blame for Lydia's reckless decisions. Mrs. Bennet is the one who encouraged Lydia to pursue men this way and to view marriage as the end-all and be-all without instructing her on the impropriety of getting a husband in this way. Of course, when all is finally settled and Lydia is happily married, Mrs. Bennet misses that point herself. This is Mrs. Bennet's reaction to Lydia and Wickham's engagement. It's described that no sentiment of shame gave a damp to her triumph. And then later, she was more alive to the disgrace which the want of new clothes must reflect on her daughter's nuptials than to any sense of shame at her eloping and living with Wickham a fortnight before they took place. Mrs. Bennet has no shame, and I think that Mrs. Bennet and Lydia are both missing a really important point here, and that's that this marriage is not the same as if Jane and Bingley got married. This marriage is tinted with shame and impropriety, and yet to Mrs. Bennet, it's just a marriage. It's happy, and it's everything that she's worked for. So even though Mrs. Bennet's values align with society in some respects, and even though she's the voice of reason when it comes to the necessity of her daughters in finding good matches, there's clearly something wrong with Mrs. Bennet's attitudes towards marriage. There's something that she just doesn't quite understand about society and what is appropriate and proper. And Mrs. Bennet might have passed her beauty and her confidence onto her daughters, but she clearly hasn't been able to teach her daughters propriety because she has none herself. And in this way, I feel really sorry for Mrs. Bennet, because her overzealousness and general lack of decorum are what make her such a laughingstock. She's trying to do what's best for her daughters, but she's so misguided. It almost makes me wonder if she truly doesn't understand what these social conventions are, or if she has just decided to woefully ignore them. There are arguments that can be made for both options. We know that Mrs. Bennet was a tradesman's daughter, and through her good looks and flirtation, she married into the gentry. So is it possible that nobody ever told her what was appropriate and what was expected for her new class status? Is she really that dim-witted that she hasn't figured it out yet? Maybe. It's possible. There's another argument to be made that Mrs. Bennet knows full well about the societal norms and expectations, but she's just not willing to admit that she has made a mistake with Lydia, or with anything, to herself or to the reader. Mrs. Bennet is certainly quite a challenging character, and she's certainly one that I have trouble wrapping my head around sometimes, and that's just what I love so much about her. She can be funny, and she can be reasonable, and yet we tend not to take her seriously. In some respects, she reflects society's viewpoints on practical marriages. So Mrs. Bennet is such a fun character to talk about, and I'm not entirely sure that I've figured her out yet, but I'm interested in hearing what you think of Mrs. Bennet and the role she plays in the book and the role she plays in raising her daughters and framing their values with regards to marriage and a woman's role in society. I'm so excited to hear all of your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Bye!